It is often said that race is a social construct, not a biological reality. To anyone inclined to make this point, I would pose the following question. Is species a social construct or a biological reality? I imagine that most would agree that species is biologically real, in the sense that there are real biological differences between, say for instance, a grizzly bear and a polar bear. But, hold on now. Polar bears and grizzly bears can interbreed and produce offspring that display some of the characteristics of each species of bear. So how do we classify the hybrids? One option is to make a separate growler bear category, but that doesn't solve the essential classification problem. What then would we do with the bear having 1/4 grizzly ancestry and 3/4 polar bear ancestry? Would he be polar enough to be called a true polar bear? It's not clear, and any line drawn between different groups of bear will ultimately be arbitrary. So how then should the distinction be made? While we consider this question, something to keep in mind is that polar bears are a threatened species, while grizzlies are not. So the classification of any particular bear as a grizzly versus polar could have real ramifications in whether that bear qualifies for special protections. Thus far, hybrids have been rare enough that such distinctions did not need to be made, but what if this ceased to be the case? What if some change in their environment made migration easier, and the different species of bear started living in the same area more frequently, and thus hybrid bears became more common? Species classification might suddenly become an important issue for conservationists. In such a world, different conservationist groups might develop different standards for classification. Perhaps one group might say that any bear with any known grizzly ancestry would be considered grizzly, and thus not worthy of any special protection. But perhaps another group might argue the opposite, that even a small amount of polar ancestry makes a bear worthy of preservation. Perhaps another group might use 3 categories, polar and grizzly for purebreds, and mongrel for any other bear, and then afford the hybrids an even lower status than the grizzlies. And perhaps yet another group might use some specific measurable physical standard to make the distinctions, such as all bears with greater than 50% hair coverage on the soles of their feet are polar bears. In addition to the possibility of different standards for different groups, the issue could be further complicated by the possibility of misclassification. A bear with 7/8 polar ancestry could probably pass as pure polar if he needed to. Or perhaps a different type of bear entirely could pass as a hybrid, so long as people didn't look too closely. Now the thing to keep in mind is that none of these different classification schemes is more correct, biologically speaking. Everyone agrees on the biological facts here. When Group A says that Boris the bear is a grizzly, and Group B says he's a polar bear, they're not disagreeing about Boris's biology or his ancestry. They're merely quibbling over labels and where to allocate their group's special treatment. Now here's the key point. Everything I have said here about species of bear is what sociologists say about race. The arbitrariness of dividing lines, the difference of opinion on classification schemes, the use of classifications to allocate differing treatment, the possibility of passing as part of a group that would not necessarily be entailed by one's ancestry, the fact that an individual might be put in different categories by different people. These are the phenomena that sociologists are referring to when they say that race is a social construct. So the question is this. Does anything I have said here about bears imply that there is no biological difference between grizzly bears and polar bears? Answer: of course not. And the same is true of human races. You see, the sociologists are playing a trick on us here. When they say race is a social construct, not a biological reality, it sounds as though the first half of that sentence implies the second half. But when you drill down to what they mean by social construct, you discover that no such thing is implied. And in fact, social construction, as it's used here, is an idea with no real content. Race is a social construct in the sense that racial categories are words that are created by humans to describe things in the world. But so are categories of languages, colors, weather patterns, and yes, even species. All categorization is subject to fuzzy boundaries or to misunderstandings or misuses by humans, or to some degree of differing opinions, but none of that makes the categorization itself illegitimate. You would never say that language categorization is illegitimate because people sometimes argue about whether Galician Spanish is the same as Portuguese, or that color is a social construct because nobody can tell the difference between celadon and emerald, or that rain is a social construct because drizzle exists. Yet all of these statements would make just as much sense as the claim that race is a social construct. If you can make the same claim about literally anything, then your claim is basically meaningless. The reason people go around saying race is a social construct and gender is a social construct, but not species is a social construct or color is a social construct, is because they want to imply, without actually proving, that the races and the genders are the same. But their arguments do not show that. If you wanted to actually prove that the races are the same, you would need to provide some empirical data showing that. Pontificating about historical perceptions of race is insufficient. Perceptions are important, to be sure, but there is also a reality underlying them, and if you allow yourself to confuse the two, you could end up believing all sorts of crazy things.